snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the quiet suburban neighborhood. Christmas lights twinkled in synchronized cheer, casting warm hues of red, green, and gold onto the untouched snow. The houses were snug and bright, their windows glowing with the comforts of the season. Families gathered around trees, laughter spilling out into the cold air like visible breath. But for Ellie Winters, the stillness felt wrong. She tightened her scarf and quickened her pace down Birchwood Lane, arms clutching the last-minute gift she'd picked up at the mall. It was nearing midnight, and the streets were empty, the usual festive bustle reduced to silence. Her boots crunched on the snow-packed sidewalk as she glanced over her shoulder. Nobody there. "Calm down," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. The streets were dead tonight because everyone was home, celebrating with their loved ones. No need to let her imagination run wild. She passed a gaudy display featuring an inflatable Santa and his reindeer. Rudolph's red nose flickered erratically, making the whole thing feel more sinister than charming. Ellie chuckled nervously and kept moving, but as she turned the corner, she froze. At the end of the street, half shrouded in shadows, stood a figure in a Santa Claus suit. He was tall, unnaturally so, and eerily still, his bulk almost blending with the snow-covered landscape. His face was obscured by the drooping brim of his hat and the thick snowy beard. Ellie forced a smile. "Good evening," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Merry Christmas." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, like a curious predator studying its prey. Ellie's stomach churned. "All right," she whispered to herself, her breath puffing out in clouds. "Just a drunk." She sidestepped into the street to give him a wide berth. The crunch of her boots felt deafening in the quiet. She refused to look back, focusing on the faint glow of her apartment complex a few blocks away. Then came a sound, a low, deep ho, 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 but it wasn't jovial. It rumbled with malice, an animalistic growl masquerading as laughter. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She spun around. The sidewalk was empty. Ellie barely slept that night. Every creak of her apartment seemed amplified, every distant sound a threat. She double-checked her locks, drew her curtains tight, and crawled into bed with her phone clutched in her hand. By the time dawn broke, she convinced herself it was just a trick of her mind. The holiday stress, the late hour, everything had conspired to spook her. But she wasn't the only one. Across town, blood seeped into the pristine snow in front of a small, darkened house. The Smith family's lights still blinked in cheerful rhythm, oblivious to the horror within. A pair of bodies, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, lay splayed in grotesque poses, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Between them, painted in their blood, was a crude approximation of a Christmas tree. In the corner of the room, a man in a Santa suit perched on an overstuffed armchair. His red coat was flecked with dark stains, and his gloved hands cradled a sharpened candy cane, the tip glistening crimson. His face, pale and sickly under the faux beard, wore a maniacal grin. "Silent night," he sang softly, his voice lilting. "Holy night." He rose, towering and deliberate, and plucked an ornament from the tree. It was a glittering silver star, delicate and glassy. He stared at it for a moment before crushing it in his fist, the shards slicing into his glove and drawing blood. The star wasn't perfect. None of this was perfect. Not yet. By Christmas Eve night, the town was in a frenzy. News of the Smith family murders had spread, plunging the community into a state of fear. The police assured everyone they were investigating, but details were scarce. The only clue was a bloody footprint near the back door, larger than any of the officers had ever seen. Ellie tried to put it out of her mind. She had enough to worry about. Wrapping gifts, finishing her Christmas cards, and trying to enjoy the holiday despite her nagging unease. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, flipping through the channels until she landed on an old Christmas movie. The glow of the television bathed the room in soft blue light. For the first time in days, Ellie felt a semblance of calm. She leaned back, letting herself sink into the cushions. Then came the knock. Her eyes snapped open. She glanced at the clock, 10:34 p.m. Frowning, she set her glass down and approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice wary. No answer. The knock came again, harder this time. Ellie's chest tightened. She peered through the peephole. A man in a Santa suit stood on the porch, his face obscured by shadow. In one gloved hand, he held a large sack slung over his shoulder. "Go away," Ellie said, her voice shaking. The man didn't move. Heart pounding, Ellie backed away from the door. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but before the call could connect, the knocking turned into pounding. The door frame rattled, the force reverberating through the apartment. Ellie let out a scream as the door cracked under the weight of a brutal kick. She ran to the kitchen, fumbling for a knife as the door splintered open behind her. "Stay away," she shouted, brandishing the blade. The Santa stepped inside, his head tilting in that same predatory manner she'd seen the night before. His coat was filthy, soaked through with dark, rust-colored stains. His gloved hands clenched the sack tightly. Ellie lunged, but he caught her wrist mid-swing with inhuman strength. The knife clattered to the floor as he yanked her closer, his breath hot and rancid through the fabric of the beard. "Merry Christmas," he rasped, his voice guttural. Then he swung the sack. It connected with a sickening thud, sending Ellie sprawling to the ground. Darkness overtook her as the Santa loomed above, his shadow swallowing the room. Ellie awoke to the sound of jingling bells. Her head throbbed and her vision swam as she struggled to sit up. She was no longer in her apartment. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the coppery stench of blood. Strings of Christmas lights hung haphazardly from the ceiling, their blinking patterns erratic and nauseating. Around her were the bodies, dozens of them, arranged in grotesque tableaus. A man slumped in a rocking chair, his throat slashed and stuffed with tinsel. A woman strung up like an ornament on a makeshift tree fashioned from bloodied wood. Each victim wore an expression of terror, their eyes wide and glassy. Ellie gagged, her stomach lurching. She tried to move, but her wrists and ankles were bound with thick cords of Christmas ribbon. "Ah, you're awake," came the voice. She turned her head to see the Santa standing in the corner, meticulously carving something into the wall with a jagged shard of glass. His back was hunched, his shoulders shaking with effort. When he stepped aside, Ellie saw his handiwork. A crude drawing of a sleigh, its runners dripping with red. "What do you want?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The Santa turned to her, his grin widening. "To make it perfect," he said simply. He picked up a sharpened candy cane and approached her slowly, his boots crunching on broken ornaments scattered across the floor. Ellie thrashed against her bonds, her screams muffled by the garland he'd stuffed into her mouth. "Shh," he cooed, kneeling beside her. "You'll ruin the surprise." He traced the candy cane along her cheek, his eyes gleaming with unholy delight. "You'll be my crowning jewel." Ellie's survival instinct kicked in. As the Santa leaned closer, she mustered every ounce of strength and slammed her head forward, catching him in the nose. He roared in pain, clutching his face as she writhed against her bindings. The ribbon cut into her skin, but she didn't care. Adrenaline numbed the pain. Her wrists came free first. She grabbed a shard of broken ornament and slashed at the ribbons around her ankles, all while the Santa stumbled backward, blood dripping through his gloved fingers. "Not nice!" he bellowed, lunging toward her. Ellie rolled out of his grasp, grabbing a length of shattered Christmas lights. She swung them like a whip, the jagged bulbs slicing into his face. He howled, his grin twisting into a snarl. Ellie didn't wait. She bolted for the door, her bare feet slipping on the blood-slick floor. The hallway beyond was a maze of horror. More bodies, more decorations twisted into grotesque parodies of Christmas cheer. She gagged but kept running, the sound of heavy boots echoing behind her. "Run, little elf," the Santa taunted, his voice booming. "The fun's just beginning." She burst into the night, the icy air biting at her skin. The house she'd escaped was a derelict cabin on the edge of the woods, its windows glowing faintly with the sickly light of the Christmas displays inside. She didn't stop to look back, plunging into the trees as the Santa's guttural laughter followed her. The snow muffled her footsteps. but she knew he was close. She could hear the jingle of his bells, the crunch of his boots growing louder. "Ellie," he sang, his voice mocking, "Santa sees you when you're sleeping." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she spotted the faint glow of the town ahead. She pushed herself harder, the branches clawing at her arms and face. Suddenly he was there, stepping out from the shadows. He moved impossibly fast, his bloodied face illuminated by the moonlight. Ellie skidded to a halt, her eyes darting around for a weapon. The Santa raised his sack, the fabric bulging with something heavy and misshapen. "Time to unwrap your gift," he snarled. Ellie grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with all her might. It connected with his head, sending him reeling. She didn't wait to see if he'd recover. She ran, the lights of the town growing brighter with each desperate step. Ellie stumbled into the nearest police station, her body trembling and covered in blood that wasn't hers. She collapsed onto the floor, her voice hoarse as she screamed about the Santa, the cabin, the bodies. The officers exchanged uneasy glances but quickly mobilized. They combed the woods, following Ellie's frantic directions to the cabin. But when they arrived, it was empty. The bodies were gone, the blood scrubbed clean. Only the faint smell of pine and peppermint lingered in the air. Ellie sat in the back of a patrol car, her hands clutching a thermal blanket. She stared out into the night, her eyes wide and unblinking. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of jingling bells and a deep guttural ho-ho-ho.